President Trump may soon issue his very first veto. That's what he's threatened to do if the Senate votes today to reject his national emergency declaration at the southern border.
Several Republicans say they will vote against the president on that just a day after another bipartisan rebuke of White House policies. The Senate voted yesterday for a second time to pull U.S. troops from the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The president has threatened to veto that measure as well. CBS News Chief Washington correspondent, we should say, Major Garrett is with us from the White House.
What difference does it make?
It makes a big difference. We want to get it right. So, Major, what do we expect from the Senate, given that the president is threatening to veto this national emergency declaration today?
Right. So what we have is a situation that's going to be very interesting, historic in the sense that Senate Republicans are going to team up with Democrats to give the president a rebuke on his signature issue, border control, border barriers, border fencing, border wall, whatever you want to call it. And yet it will be anticlimactic and interesting and historic at the same time. Why? Because this has been a slow-moving rebuke of President Trump for essentially weeks since he declared the national emergency. It's been clear there would be a motion of disapproval in the House, that it would pass there. Because it's a privileged motion, it has to be voted on by the Senate. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader there, can't table it. He's got to have a vote on it. And because it's a live, votable action on the Senate floor, Republicans have to decide what to do. And the White House puts the range of Republican defections as high as 12. What they don't want is a massive Senate vote with lots and lots of Republicans joining Democrats to essentially tell the president, you're wrong in using this national emergency declaration. So it will pass the Senate. The big number to watch is how high is that number of Republican defections. 4, 5, or 6, the White House can live with that. Up to 12, the White House will tolerate that. And to this underlying question, well, has the president been lobbying Republican senators and urging them, begging them, pleading with them, cajoling, all the typical measures? No. The White House feels very simply about this issue. Everyone knows it's the president's biggest issue, that he's against Congress writ large, Republican and Democrat. That means he's fighting the system. And for Trump-based supporters, those two things are positively reinforcing. Fighting for the border wall and going up against Congress, both parties, because he's the outsider, he's the disruptor. So under a normal set of circumstances, any kind of quote-unquote rebuke like this might trouble a White House. It doesn't this one. They're going to take the vote, veto it, have it sustained in the House, and guess what? When all the dust settles, historic or otherwise, the president's national emergency declaration will stand.
That was going to be my next question, because if he does veto it, then sort of where do we go from here? I mean, I don't think you can virtually ignore the fact that Congress, both houses were not in favor of this.
Right.
I know the president isn't, whatever is happening right now in terms of the conversations in the White House, often the president does whatever he wants afterwards, and I can't see him not, seriously, Major, I can't see him not tweeting about some of the defections here, the
Sure.
lawmakers that wouldn't back him up. So, I mean, where do we go after this?
So here's the process. President vetoes it, then the House has a vote to whether to sustain or override that veto. Overriding a presidential veto requires 2/3 of those president voting. That's not going to happen. There'll be enough Republicans in the House to sustain the president's veto, and that's where the issue ends. But to your underlying point, Anne-Marie, you're absolutely right. This will not sit well with the president, and the conversations from this White House and from this president to Senate Republicans is very simple. Go ahead. If you think you are better off politically challenging your sitting president on his biggest issue, which Republican primary voters have told the country over and over and over again in their resilient support of this president they care about, go ahead. That's a political risk you're taking. And what the White House believes is some Senate Republicans who have been toying with this idea of voting against the president very well in the end might not, feeling that the political terrain is safer with the president than opposed to him. And the president and the White House have not made a direct threat, but said, if you want the president to come help you in 2020 at your rallies and draw huge crowds, well, you might want to think about this vote in that context. So some underlying political pressure downstream from this White House. But in the main, the president knows he can prevail on this, suffer a rebuke in the process, but also send a very strong political message to his base that he's fighting, and even if Republicans are against him, he's going to fight and ultimately prevail.
Major, can I just ask you, before we move on to another subject, to provide some clarity for our audience who may be wondering about this? The president, again, in his tweet about the national emergency, said that the wall, he always says this, and I'm quoting his tweet, which is already under major construction. Now, during the shutdown, reporters from this network and others, newspapers, went to the border and said that there is no major wall construction happening. That, in fact, the president saying so is misleading. Where are we today with that statement from the president?
So a lot of this was discussed in the run-up to the unveiling of the president's 2020 federal budget. So with the money secured in earlier Congresses, there is about 122 miles of barrier that is either being repaired or reinforced, or in some cases newly constructed. This is terrain where either barriers currently exist or they're high priority areas for the Border Patrol. Now, so when the president says already being constructed, well, it all depends on what your terminology is and your definition of already being constructed is. What he knows is he has to say something to those Trump supporters who want more border barrier, more border wall than currently exists. To satisfy them, he tells them either existing structures are being reinforced or in some cases new areas are being built. But in no way, shape, or form is a new wall under active and considerable construction. Now, with the $8.6 billion that the White House is going to claim, both through appropriations and this national emergency declaration, more miles will be either reinforced or newly constructed. And to keep it in mind, how many miles in that amount of money? Just do this back of the envelope estimate. $25 million per mile. That's what it costs for border barrier construction. $25 million per mile. You can do the math yourself. $8.6 billion in the last year, divided by 25 million, you can come up with your mileage. And with the new request in this new fiscal year, which hasn't even been authorized or appropriated by Congress, the administration says by 2020, 722 miles will either be reinforced or newly constructed. That's the bottom line.
All right. Major Garrett for us at the White House. Major, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Sure.